All right, y'all. Last week we talked about the 7 best values in Underdog Fantasy's Best Ball Mania 5 contest. And today I get the privilege of bringing the hammer down and talking about the 7 worst values in Best Ball Mania 5. And as we continue to see wide receivers get pushed higher and higher on these draft boards, we are starting to see a lot of players that are getting overvalued and overpriced. So expect a heavy dose of wide receiver talk today. But without further ado, let's jump right on in. First player that we're going to talk about is Brandon Aiyuk, who currently goes as the wide receiver 11 in drafts, somewhere in the early to mid second round. And last year was a really, really good year for Brandon Aiyuk. He was going as the wide receiver 24 in drafts at this time last year, and he finished as the wide receiver 14. 1,300 receiving yards, and he sprinkled in some top 5 and top 10 finishes along the way. So by all means, a very good year for Brandon Aiyuk, but this year it's a little bit different. He's a top 12 wide receiver in drafts right now, and that's not a great value for a couple reasons. One, last year was a pretty hyper efficient year for him. 1,300 yards is great, but it's not so great doing that on just 75 catches and 105 targets. That's about 18 yards per reception. So that was second highest of all wide receivers with at least 40 targets. And according to historical data, we're due for some regression. Over on the RotoViz screener, as you can see on your screen, most of these players that were in their 4th year and had 17 yards per reception, going into year 5, they had just 15.1 yards per reception in year 5. So nearly 3 yards less for Brandon Aiyuk. So with regression coming in that yards department, we need to see an uptick in volume, which is very possible. I mean, you can see here Santana Moss, Tyler Lockett, and heck, even Corey Bradford back in 2001 on a much smaller scale got that uptick in volume. The only problem for Brandon Aiyuk, though, is that his situation is still the same, maybe even a little bit tougher, right? Christian McCaffrey is still there. Deebo Samuel is still there. George Kittle is still there. And then they went out and drafted Ricky Pearsall in the first round of the draft this year. So the chances are, with how this team plays and the added competition in this wide receiver room, he's not a guarantee to get that huge jump in volume that he would need when we are going to see some regression in his total yards. So things could change. Right. There have been rumors about him getting traded, and that everything could change if he gets traded. But banking on a trade happening to justify this price point is extremely risky for a guy you're spending a top 20 pick on. And to be completely honest, I would target guys like Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, because you're getting touches and scoring upside with those guys instead of Aiyuk, who is likely heading for some kind of regression. Let's talk about Chris Olave next, who currently goes one spot after Brandon Aiyuk in drafts as the wide receiver 12. And last year, Chris Olave was the wide receiver 19 and a half PPR. And just for context, best ball is played in half PPR format. So Chris Olave, who is wide receiver 1 caliber, who gets a ton of volume, doesn't exactly have the same value as he does in full PPR. Because again, you're getting... Let's talk about Chris Olave next, who actually goes one spot behind Brandon Aiyuk as the wide receiver 12 in drafts right now. And last year, Chris Olave was the wide receiver 19 in half PPR. And just for context, best ball is played in half PPR. So these volume guys, these volume wide receivers, these wide receiver 1 volume guys don't exactly have the same value because you're getting half of a point less than you would in full PPR. So Chris Olave, again, wide receiver 19 and a half PPR, averaged just 11 and a half fantasy points per game after going at this exact spot last year. So wasn't exactly a disappointment, but he didn't necessarily return on his price tag either. There is some optimism going into year 3 now for Chris Olave, right? He's turning 24. There's no additional competition on this team. Mike Thomas is out of town now. So it really is just Chris Olave. And now we don't have Pete Carmichael anymore. We don't have the Sean Payton offense anymore. We have Clint Kubiak coming in to be their offensive coordinator. But this just comes down to the type of player that Chris Olave is, right? I described him as the wide receiver 1 that gets a ton of volume. The only problem is that Chris Olave just does not score touchdowns. He's Michael Pittman light, where, again, fed targets, gets a ton of receptions. He's going to rack up some yards on top of that. He just won't score. And when we're in best ball, we're looking for upside. And because of that, Olave's upside is relatively capped, right? When we take a look at his stats from last year, it, there were 2 finishes with 18, handful of 13 to 15 point finishes. So it wasn't like the end of the world. But Olave's spike weeks were few and far between because he just didn't score. So again, when we talk about Chris Olave going as a top 12 wide receiver in drafts right now, we need him to we are hoping that he can crack this top 8, top 9 list, right? The top 8 to 9 guys are guys that get volume and have good touchdown upside. Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra, Puka Nacua, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, and even Marvin Harrison Jr. if you want to throw him in there as well. But these next 5 to 6 guys fall into one of two pools. Either they are hyper efficient guys like Brandon Aiyuk, who we just talked about, Deebo Samuel, heck, even Nico Collins, or the other pool is players that have gotten volume or are on track to get volume, but they may not score a lot because of the other pieces around them, right? Drake London, Devontae Adams, and Chris Olave as well. I don't want to use high to mid second round capital on either of these pools of players because our hyper efficient guys are due for some kind of regression unless they get an uptick in volume, which is pretty unlikely, at least for the guys that I mentioned. And then our volume guys, they just don't have as much value in half PPR format. So when looking at these volume guys and Chris Olave specifically, you'd be best to just wait because you can find volume guys in later rounds, right? I called Chris Olave, Michael Pittman Jr. Just one round more expensive, right? So wait for a guy like Michael Pittman if you're looking for volume, or heck, you could even wait for Cooper Kupp, who goes shortly after Michael Pittman as well. So Chris Olave just feels like another trap this year, right? Oh, he's the wide receiver 1. There's no one else there. He's going to get a ton of targets, which is true. It has its place in best ball. It's just not in the middle of the second round in your drafts. Nico Collins is the next wide receiver that we're going to talk about. And he's also going in the second round of drafts right now as the wide receiver 15. So 3 wide receivers right off the top in the second round that are just not great values for this year. Nico Collins is commonly going earlier than his ADP, right? His ADP would say that he's going late second round. He's going like mid to even early second round because everyone is fascinated with his Houston Texans offense, right? Taking a look at last year, Nico Collins, wide receiver 9 last year, averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game after going in the 9th round of drafts last year. So by all means, winner. He won people a lot of money last year. Only problem that I see with Nico Collins is that he did this on only 109 targets last year, which is 5th fewest for a top 10 wide receiver since 2010. And we look at the other guys in this bottom 5, Adam Thielen in 2020, Doug Baldwin in 2015, Jordy Nelson in 2011, and Mike Wallace in 2010. The average fantasy points for these guys in their following year after, only having less than 110 targets, but still finishing inside the top 10 wide receivers, they followed that up with 12.9 fantasy points per game. So that was approximately the wide receiver 16 last year. So kind of, you can make an argument that we're kind of drafting Nico Collins at a relative ceiling at this point, but that's okay in the eyes of some people because they see the kind of spike weeks that Nico Collins can offer them, right? Last year, Nico Collins had 5 games inside the top 10. In each of those games, he averaged 27 fantasy points per game. That is absurd, right? So the argument can be made that it doesn't really matter where he goes. It's going to be okay because he's going to give you these kind of spike weeks. But the odds of these spike weeks happening in maybe the best way to say it is this: getting 5 of these spike weeks at 27 fantasy points per game is incredibly unlikely again this year. And due to in part because the Texans went out and traded for Stephon Diggs, but they also brought in Joe Mixon. And that's probably the most the move that's going the most under the radar when talking about these Texans wide receivers. First with Diggs has commanded a 28% target share over the last 4 years. So he is in no way disappearing or going away in this Texans offense. And then when they get closer to the goal line, they don't have to rely on Devin Singletary and Damian Pierce to score the touchdown. They got Joe Mixon back there, and he can score the rock, right? So the spike weeks for Nico Collins, still within the realm of possibility, But if you're thinking about getting if you're getting Nico Collins and thinking, wow, he could get an uptick in targets because you get year two CJ Stroud and all these kind of things, you might be disappointed because again, you've got arguably the wide receiver one on this team. And I think a lot of people don't want to say that or admit it, but Stephon Diggs is the wide receiver one in this offense. Then you've got a running game with Joe Mixon. So there are a lot of question marks that people have. And it seems like the assumption is that Nico Collins is one of the best values, and they just kind of ignore all of these question marks. All right, before I even start with George Pickens, I just want to say I'm a huge fan of his talent and his upside. The only problem is his quarterbacks and his offensive coordinator, right? He is pretty much the only target in the passing game, right? You've got Pat Freiermuth, you've got Roman Wilson, you've got Van Jefferson, but like George Pickens is kind of head and shoulders above those guys in terms of talent, right? But again, his quarterbacks are Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. Now, Justin Fields did help support DJ Moore to a top 10 season last year. But when Arthur Smith is your offensive coordinator, it doesn't really matter, right? The Falcons threw the ball at a bottom 5 rate last year with weapons like Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson. And like I said at the top, this weapon room for Pittsburgh, George Pickens, Roman Wilson, Van Jefferson, Pat Freiermuth, and then like Najee and Jalen Warren, if you want to include the running backs in there. The quarterbacks are better, right? We have to admit that. Justin Fields, Russell Wilson are better than Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. But the big reason that a lot of people speculate why Atlanta just did not throw the ball and why Drake London and Kyle Pitts disappointed last year is because Arthur Smith didn't trust his quarterbacks. If trust is really the issue, is he really going to trust a worse, wide receiver room or pass catching, or is he really going to trust these kind of pass catching options to do the stuff that he wants? He can trust his quarterbacks, but is he going to have that same trust for his pass catchers, right? So what puts Pickens here at the wide receiver 28 in drafts is because he's one of the last team wide receiver ones that's available. And with his athletic profile, he goes ahead of the most of the rest of them, right? You've got Keon Coleman or Ladd McConkey or even Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin, right? Like those are other wide receiver ones that are going after him. And Pickens's athletic profile just, I don't want to say it guarantees a better finish, but there's reason to believe that he has higher upside than those guys. But the problem is that he's going ahead of guys like Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, and I mentioned Christian Kirk, Jaden Reed, even, who are in much better offenses, right? Who are going to still command a good amount of targets, if not more than what Pickens could get with Arthur Smith as his offensive coordinator. So there's not much else to George Pickens' argument as a bad value, other than the fact that you can find better values in the round or two after where Pickens currently goes, right? Jaden Reed, Christian Kirk, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, just some of the names that go after him that I find to be better values than Pickens. All righty, last wide receiver before I go on to the other positions. Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 34, going after George Pickens, is one of these values that I just cannot wrap my head around. There's a lot of different things that are cooking into his ADP right now. First is the belief in these lighter weight wide receivers. When we take a look at all wide receivers since 2000, that are 165 pounds or less, there has only been one wide receiver who found success in year one. That's Tank Dell. So I'd venture to say that Tank Dell is the outlier or even the anomaly, then he is the trend, right? Because he's been the only one. So can Worthy also be that? Can he also be an outlier and an anomaly? There's an argument for it, but that's what leads me to my next point. I don't think so, because his overall game right now, I don't believe that he can have success early on in his career, at least for, let's just focus on this year. I think he's going to struggle mightily this year because according to Matt Harmon's reception perception, which by the way, highly recommend go checking that out. His work is incredibly insightful when it comes to all of these wide receivers. But Xavier Worthy, solid separator in man and zone coverage, but when it came to press coverage, it left a lot to be desired. 28th percentile in success versus press coverage. That's only going to get tougher in the NFL. That's the most worrisome metric for Worthy. And at least for year one, he's going to be in a hyper and super specific role for this Kansas City Chiefs offense. So on top of all these things, what is that role going to be for the Chiefs? And I have to think that for a guy that's 165 pounds, he's going to be playing in the slots a lot more. But if we were to look back at the Chiefs from last year, the one player that found the most success in the slot was Rashee Rice, right? And now we all know that he's more than likely going to be suspended, right? But however long that is, let's say it's 8 games, you're only going to be getting 8 weeks of Xavier Worthy, because once Rashee Rice comes back and they only go to 2 wide receiver sets, it's going to be Rashee Rice and Marquise Brown. It's going to be those 2 guys. It's not going to be Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy, or even Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy, right? And if they are going to choose someone to go to the slot in 2 wide receiver sets, it's going to be Rashee Rice, right? So we're paying wide receiver 34 capital for a guy that is going to get the bulk of his work early on in the season, however long Rashee Rice is suspended for. And then when Rice comes back, he's going to kind of take a back seat a little bit just with how this offense operates, right? So yes, you can get some good spike weeks, because again, like with Patrick Mahomes and the speed that he has, he's going to give you some very solid weeks. But you can also find these kind of spike weeks that Xavier Worthy can have like a round or 2 later, right? Jordan Addison goes 10 picks after him. And Jordan Addison in this Minnesota offense can also find a path to spike weeks, right? Or even Brian Thomas Jr. also goes a full round after Xavier Worthy, right? Huge deep threat for this Jacksonville team, for a quarterback like Trevor Lawrence. They will want to throw the ball downfield. That plays right into Brian Thomas Jr.'s game. So you can look at any of those wide receivers, or if you want to take a running back, you're looking at Alvin Kamara, David Montgomery, and ask yourself, I'd rather have Xavier Worthy, Alvin Kamara, or David Montgomery? And I would assume that most people would say that Xavier Worthy would be the third option out of those 3. All right, we are done with wide receivers now. So let's go on to a tight end and talk about George Kittle. And we have Brandon Aiyuk and George Kittle on this video on the Niners. So it may come across as like, wow, Tyler's really out on these San Francisco players. No, because you do want to invest in the high octane, high scoring offenses like San Francisco. The only problem is that we are going to see regression also for George Kittle, right? We saw regression in touchdowns, right? Because he finished with 11 in 2022, finished with 6. So we saw that. But what we didn't see happening or coming was that his yards per reception and overall yards really were just going to skyrocket, right? When we take a look at last year for George Kittle, he had some games with 22, 16, 30, 8, 15, 17, 25, 27, 18. Those are all nuts, right? So with regression coming in the yards, we either need another hyper efficient year like this past season, which won't happen because again, regression, or we need the uptick in touchdowns, excuse me. If neither of those happen, we then are looking at an uptick in volume, and that's just not going to happen because again, you've got Debo, Aiyuk, McCaffrey, and now Ricky Pearsall. I'll admit, if Brandon Aiyuk or Debo Samuel get traded, then Kittle instantly becomes a much better investment. But with that sounding unlikely at this current time, you should just probably wait on a tight end, because Kittle, yes, he can give you spike weeks, but he is incredibly streaky. He can give you 2 to 3 weeks where he's producing as a top 5 tight end. In the next 2 to 3 weeks, he's outside of the top 20, top 25, right? You do need a tight end in best ball, right? So you may end up taking Kittle in certain builds, right? If you're trying to build a correlation with San Francisco players, then it kind of makes sense. But if you don't have a tight end and you're looking at George Kittle and you're like, wow, I could take Kittle here, My recommendation would be to wait. Evan Ingram, much more consistent tight end, who is still going to have a very prominent role in this Jacksonville offense, goes 10 picks after George Kittle. Jake Ferguson, year 2 as a Cowboys tight end, with just CeeDee Lamb in a little threat of a run game in front of him. He goes 20 picks after George Kittle. Then you're looking at like David Njoku, Brock Bowers, Dallas Goedert, TJ Hawkinson, all going at least 40 picks after Kittle. That's 3 rounds after George Kittle, right? My recommendation, if you are needing a tight end or you have 0 tight ends and Kittle is right there, don't fall for the trap. Be patient and wait for one of these other tight ends in the rounds after Kittle. All right, and the last guy that we're going to talk about is Najee Harris. He currently goes in the 8th round of drafts as a running back 23. And to be honest, there will probably be a lot of people calling Najee Harris a value because he has never gone this low in drafts before, right? 2022, he was going as a running back 6 in the 1st round. Then last season, 2023, running back 13 in the 4th round, right? This year, again, running back 23 in the 8th round. So the argument can be made that he is a value because despite getting drafted that high, he still has not finished below the running back 23. He finished as a running back 14 in 2022 and finished as the running back 21 in 2023. But he is an avoid for me and the other fellows for multiple reasons, but very simple reasons. The first being, he's a 25-year-old running back who has been seeing decreased volume and decreased efficiency in production the last 2 years. The second thing, he averaged just 60 yards a game last year with minimal receiving work. So if he didn't score either receiving or rushing, you're only getting like 6, 7, 8 fantasy points in a week, and that's just not ideal when we are in these contests for a lot of money on the line. Third reason, before the last 2 weeks of the season, where he saw 26 and 27 carries, he was the running back 28, averaging just 9 points per game. So it actually got worse. It hit, I don't want to say rock bottom, because that would say like, oh, he can only go up from here. But it was bad last year. It was very, very bad. And the last reason, and probably the main reason, is just who else is going around him in drafts. His teammate Jaylen Warren goes 5 picks after him. Jonathan Brooks goes shortly after him as well. Guys like Zach Moss, Tony Pollard, James Conner, and Raheem Mostert go after him as well. And they're all in offenses that should be scoring more than Pittsburgh. Just a friendly reminder that with Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson last year, the Falcons were bottom 8 in scoring last year. And I think a lot of people will fall for that trap, right? Again, he has not gone this late in drafts before. And look, he's got Arthur Smith as offensive coordinator, and he likes to run the ball. For a guy like Najee, again, where we've been seeing decreased efficiency with the amount of touches that he's been getting, it's not exactly a guarantee, right? And again, in half PPR, when it comes for these running backs, especially like Najee with no receiving work, you need to score. Alrighty, those are the 7 worst values in Underdog Fantasy's Best Ball Mania 5 contest right now. Brandon Aiyuk, Chris Olave, Nico Collins, George Pickens, Xavier Worthy, George Kittle, and Najee Harris. And like I said at the very beginning of the video, wide receivers continue to get pushed higher and higher on the board. So we are potentially looking at a ton of overvalued and overpriced wide receivers, and we are getting discounts and good values then on other positions like running back and tight end and quarterback as well. So if you want to join in on this on the fun over on Underdog Fantasy, you can use the link in the description there. But we will be back next week, and stay tuned for our draft guide that will be coming out here in the near future. As you get ready for your drafts, you should get the Fellas Draft Guide. That'll help you out in those drafts, and especially in best ball too. You will know exactly how to approach those drafts. So again, as I sign off, make sure you're subscribed, because as we get closer and closer to the season, we'll be posting more often. Give this video a like. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Who is overvalued? Who do you like? Who do you target? Who are you not targeting? All that fun stuff. I will see you down in the comments below. So until the next video, deuces.